Welcome everyone. Today we're talking Shadow Priest and diving into the recent spec overhaul to answer the question, did Blizzard just save Shadow Priest? Now, I can already hear a lot of you saying, wasn't Shadow broken and overpowered during a large percentage of BFA? Why does it need saving? When I say Shadow needs saving, I'm referring to the core design problems of Voidform that made the spec impossible to balance during BFA on either end of the spectrum. Voidform makes it a bit of an all or nothing spec. It's either amazing or terrible, but the recent changes that Blizzard introduced in the overhaul, specifically the removal of Voidform as the primary mechanic, have shown us that Blizzard is committed to revamping the spec to correct some of these issues. Whether or not that effort will be successful is anyone's guess, but I have to say, I'm excited to see where it's going, and I'm excited to discuss it with you today. Now, I want to share what I consider the three most important design features that make a spec good. First, the spec needs to be balanceable. To be clear, I'm not saying the spec needs to be balanced on day one, although that would be nice. The reality is, balancing is a continuous process that will go on for the entire expansion, but the core design of the spec needs to have the right knobs in place to balance the spec under all content conditions: single target, multi-target, and PvP. This is arguably the biggest failure of the Shadow Priest design in BFA. The feedback loop of crit and haste giving you more insanity, which in turn keeps you in Voidform longer, which gives you even more crit and haste, on top of the essence and corruption systems feeding you massive amounts of crit and haste, made the spec incredibly difficult to balance. A small tweak here or there had large ripple effects that would dramatically nerf or buff certain elements of Shadow's kit. I would summarize BFA as the eternal rebalance, where Blizzard slapped band-aids onto the Shadow Priest to keep it in check without addressing the core scaling concerns of Voidform. That's why I'm incredibly excited that they removed Voidform as that primary mechanic and made it a relatively minor but fun DPS cooldown. The second important design feature is a good talent system, or generally introducing more meaningful choices to the spec. There were far too many rows in BFA that literally didn't change for the entire expansion. For example, you locked in Shadow Word Void in August of 2018 and haven't touched it since. That's a problem that a lot of specs face, but I believe it's important to have competitive talent rows that allow you to modify your character's strengths and weaknesses based on the content that you're facing. The row with Twist of Fate and Misery is a great example of a talent row that forces you to make decisions. Ideally, we have a lot of these talent rows, and I think Blizzard has done a good job to at least try and fix this in Shadowlands. Obviously, we never know for sure until the numbers are tuned and the sims start running, but the fact that they're taking a stab at the stale talent rows gives me hope that Shadow is at least moving in the right direction. Third, the spec has to be fun to play. Now, I'm a big min-maxer. I play WoW as competitively as I can, but when you're throwing hundreds or even thousands of hours into a character, it needs to meet some minimum threshold of fun or you'll go insane playing it. So how fun was Shadow in BFA? Obviously, a lot of this boils down to your own personal preference, but I can say that regardless of how fun you find the Voidform mechanic, there are certain design decisions that made Voidform feel really terrible in some situations. The major fun suck of Voidform is that you gain zero benefit from lingering insanity talent or the Chorus of Insanity as right trait until you drop out of your first Voidform, which happens on average about 45 seconds after you enter combat. So you have to wait a long time to do any real damage during a boss encounter, and when a pack dies in Mythic Plus, you typically sit there screaming at your monitor for your tank to pull faster as you watch all of your stacks decay away. This is an incredibly frustrating feeling on both sides. You're either waiting to gain stacks, or you're watching them go away. There's no way to know for sure what frustrations lie ahead with the new Shadow design, but one thing's for certain, we can wave goodbye to the frustrations of ramp-ups and ramp-downs of Voidform. So now that we understand the issues with Shadow and BFA, how is Blizzard saving the Shadow Priest in Shadowlands? The short answer is, they seem to be trying really hard to address the concerns we just talked about. Voidform has effectively been removed as a core DPS mechanic, and they've removed unused talents and replaced them with talents that at least appear to be more impactful. Again, these talents are still heavily in flux, and Blizzard has stated that many of these changes are still experimental, so it's impossible to know which talents will be the best. But at the very minimum, they're trying. Let's take a look at some of these changes and how they might affect the Shadow playstyle. The biggest playstyle change is that as a Shadow Priest in Shadowlands, most of our time will no longer be spent battling against Insanity Drain. Instead, we'll be more of a builder-spender spec, where we generate Insanity and then spend it on abilities like Devouring Plague, a 6-second dot that hits like a truck. Right now, this playstyle feels a bit clunky to me on the beta, but it's possible that's just because it's new, and I'm so used to the old style. Let's talk about the other major rework. Talents. In the level 15 talent row, Shadowy Insight and Shadow Word Void have been removed, but The spirit of both talents has been added to a passive called Dark Thoughts. I really like how they bake these two talents directly into the spec while giving us new options in this row. Shadow Word Void had a 100% pick rate for all of BFA, so it's clearly useful and good to see it sticking around with the kit without wasting a talent slot. The new additions to this row are Death and Madness and Unfurling Darkness. I really like the design of both of these spells, and I hope they're balanced well enough so we get to use both. I like the idea of Death and Madness being super strong on some fights. We are getting a lot of Shadow Word Death sniping in, but the convenience, movement, and DPS increase of Unfurling Darkness has a lot of potential as well, especially in Mythic Plus. In the level 30 talent row, we're keeping Twist of Fate and Misery, which are both very strong talents, and replacing Dark Void with a similar talent, Searing Nightmare. Now, Dark Void wasn't a terrible talent and saw some use in BFA, but the thing I disliked the most about Dark Void was the 30-second cooldown. There wasn't anything you could do to accelerate this. By giving Searing Nightmare an Insanity cost, it gives us the choice of using our Insanity to do more AoE, or using our Insanity to pump more single target damage with Devouring Plague. I really like the design of this talent, and hope it's balanced well enough to be viable in Mythic Plus. Nothing was worse than using Dark Void than having your tank surprise you by pulling another pack, forcing you to single target apply all of your dots to the new mobs. Searing Nightmare gives you a lot more flexibility to either reapply at any time, or spend your Insanity on a Devouring Plague on a high priority target. The level 40 talent row is also seeing some pretty major changes. Auspicious Spirits has remained the same. Shadow Word Death has been replaced with Psychic Link, and a new experimental change has been added to Shadow Crash, giving it 3 charges and a damage amp component. This Shadow Crash change has specifically been called out as experimental, so it's a bit hard to speculate as it will most likely change before launch. But this is another good example of Blizzard's willingness to take a solid crack at giving us interesting options on each talent row. Psychic Link recently got tuned from 60% to 50% in the last patch, so it's also heavily in flux. I'm a bit worried that Auspicious Spirits and Psychic Link seem to accomplish the same thing, adding AoE damage the more dots you have out, so my fear is this choice will largely just come down to tuning, but we'll have to see how it plays out once everything is finalized and the sims come out. In the level 45 talent row, Lingering Insanity has been replaced by Damnation, which applies all 3 of your dots instantly on a 45-second cooldown. Everything in this row is a strict single target damage increase, so outside of PvP where Damnation seems pretty awesome, for PvE this talent row will most likely boil down to whichever is numerically optimal. And finally, the level 50 talent tree. Dark Ascension has been removed and replaced by Ancient Madness, which is a crit buff that operates a lot like Chorus of Insanity when you use your new Voidform damage cooldown. Legacy of the Void has been completely reworked to basically give you the old style of Voidform back. And of course, Surrender to Madness, which I don't think is possible to balance, just by the nature of its design. If an ability kills you, it has to be super strong to warrant its use. But if it is that strong, the top-end players will abuse it to no end. So my hunch is, if Surrender is the go-to on launch, it will be insane and then get nerfed into the ground, just like it was in Legion. As fun as this talent is, I really wish Blizzard would just give up on Surrender to Madness and give us a reasonable talent choice in this row. So there you have it. The major changes so far for the Shadow Priest going into Shadowlands. Is it enough? Did Blizzard save the Shadow Priest? I think they did. Moving away from Voidform has made the spec easier to balance. We have more interesting talent choices, and they removed the terrible damage ramp up and even gave us some tools to do more on-demand damage. There's still a lot of time left before Shadowlands goes live, but I'll be honest, after 6 expansions of playing my Shadow Priest, I was starting to make plans to play something else. But seeing this spec rework has renewed my faith that Blizzard hasn't given up on us just yet. I'm excited to see what Shadow has to offer in Shadowlands. And from an RP standpoint, how can they really make us bad if our spec is literally in the expansion title? But what do you think? Have these changes convinced you that Shadow will be strong next expansion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.